Bienvenidos. Welcome to our 7th installment of the Pepperdine University Graduate School of Education and Psychology's Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series, Leaders Inspiring Change. My name is Reina Garcia Ramos, and I'm a professor of education here at the Graduate School of Education and Psychology. And I'm glad that you've decided to join us this evening for what it promises to be a thought-provoking discussion on culture, education, and action. But before we begin this evening with our keynote speaker, I'd like to recognize some special guests in the evening in our audience. I'd like to recognize the Dean of the Graduate School of Education, Dr. Margaret J. Weber. I'd like to recognize our Associate Deans, Dr. Martin Jago and Robert DeMeo. They were having dinner with us. Oh, they're there. Yes. And I'd also like to recognize our alumni from our program, because you truly are our ambassadors out in the field. So if you're an alum, will you please stand? Let us recognize you. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Tonight we have the privilege to hear from a prolific educator, researcher, writer, and teacher. Dr. Sonia Nieto is currently Professor Emerita of Language, Literacy, and Culture at the School of Education at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She has taught students from elementary school through doctoral studies, and her research focus is on multicultural education, teacher education, the education of Latinos, immigrants, and other students of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. She has written many journal articles, books, chapters, and several books on these topics, including most recently, Affirming Diversity, the Sociopolitical Context of Multicultural Education, now in its 6th edition of 2012. And we were actually passing around a copy of the book earlier with some of the graduate students. And as I talked to some of the alum, they were saying, oh, when she said Linda Howard, I know exactly who she was talking about. She's also published The Light in Their Eyes, Creating Multicultural Learning Communities, now in its 2nd edition in 2010. And Language, Culture, and Teaching, Critical Perspectives, also in its 2nd edition of 2010. Dr. Nieto has a new book due out this fall, and she'll be speaking about that more this evening. And several of her current titles are for sale this evening, so please check out our book sale table over here on our left. Dr. Nieto serves on several regional and national advisory boards that focus on educational equality and social justice, and she has received many awards for her scholarship, teaching, and advocacy, including 4 honorary doctorates. Dr. Nieto was selected as a Fellow of the American Educational Research Association and as a laureate for the Kappa Delta Pi in 2011. And in 2012, she served as the Wits Claude Distinguished Scholar at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. For those of you that are alum of our program and have been through our education division, you know that we've used Dr. Nieto's work religiously in education and in our master's program. And I want to read a quote from her 1999 version of Light in Their Eyes, Creating Multicultural Learning Communities, that has always stuck with me as a challenge for me as a teacher educator that I share with my own students. And she said back in 1989, quote, "In order to become a multicultural teacher, you must first become a multicultural person," which has continued to stay with me as a challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, will you join me in welcoming Dr. Sonia Nieto?
Gracias. Thank you very much. Here, I think all of this is yours, Reina. Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction. Does everybody hear me okay? I think yeah? Okay. That's better, right? All right. Well, I am really happy to be here. Thank you for the wonderful welcome you've given me. And let me tell you what I'm going to be speaking about today. Let me start by saying that this teacher here is my daughter. She too has followed in the footsteps of both her parents and is a teacher. She's a middle school teacher. So I want to speak with you this evening about doing culturally responsive pedagogy. What does it take? And I want to broaden it from just teaching to also include other education professions. So my work has concentrated for the past several years on the following question. What does it mean to be an outstanding teacher of students of diverse backgrounds? To find out, I've interviewed many teachers from around the nation, and I've listened to their stories about what makes teaching a consequential profession. And I've tried to figure out the essential values, dispositions, and practices of excellent teachers, especially those who work with students who are often dismissed as being unworthy and uneducable. There are many such students in our society, and race, ethnicity, native language, and social class, unfortunately, often define them in negative ways. Building on this question of what makes exceptional teachers of students of diverse backgrounds, I want to speak with you this evening about another essential question. What does it mean to support educators so that they can work effectively with students of diverse backgrounds? The answer to this question, it seems to me, is just as important as the first one, because other educators, such as guidance counselors, principals, curriculum supervisors, superintendents, and others, are just as significant as teachers are in the education of young people. I've looked at the extensive literature on the question of what it means to be an outstanding teacher of students of all backgrounds, and I can summarize it as follows. To be outstanding teachers of any students, it takes a solid general education background, and I'm more and more convinced of that teachers need a good background in general studies, in liberal education, a deep knowledge of the subject matter that they're going to teach. They need to be familiar with many different pedagogical approaches. They need to have strong communication skills so that they communicate not only with their students, but also with their students' families, with their colleagues, supervisors, and so on. And they need to be effective organizers. So what does it mean to be a highly qualified teacher? In the past decade, we've also been faced with a new set of qualities or criteria, thanks to the No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top and other legislation. And these include the definition of a highly qualified teacher, including teachers' GPA, teacher certification, students' test scores or value added. And I have some real reservations about these things, because they seem awfully clinical and even cold to me. And while we can say that some of these things might be important, I would add the following. That teachers of, effective teachers of students of diverse backgrounds also have a love of students and of this subject matter. They have a love of learning and the process of learning. They have passion, energy, perseverance, humility, and of course a sense of humor to even try to have all of these things. This is a tall order for a profession that in many cases pays new teachers an embarrassingly low salary and yet expects them to know everything, to put in long hours, to buy supplies with their own money, to continue their professional development, often on their own time and with their own money, and to be teacher, parent, counselor, nurse, and confidant all in one. But this is what we expect of all good teachers. What makes teachers of students of diverse backgrounds different from these? In some ways, this is really a moot question, because today all educators, whether they're teachers or other educational professionals, are or soon will be working with students of diverse backgrounds. All students are students of diverse backgrounds. Most of the classrooms in our nation today are diverse in some combination of race, ethnicity, native language, gender, sexual orientation, social class, ability, religion, national origin, and other differences. And so when people say to me, But you know, I teach a homogeneous group of students. That's impossible. Impossible. And given current demographics and expectations for the next several decades, in most school systems, students of color specifically, because you know, when people talk about diversity, they often have in mind race and ethnicity. And it's way beyond that, as I hope I've made clear. But even if we just take into account race and ethnicity, students of color are now or will soon be the majority in most classrooms around the country. But that doesn't mean that all educators know how to be culturally responsive teachers. So what are some of the obstacles? In spite of educators' good intentions, there are numerous obstacles to becoming culturally responsive teachers. In fact, while over 40% of students in our public schools are other than white, English-speaking, and middle class, in too many cases, prospective teachers and other educators are prepared as if they were going to be teaching the students of 50 years ago. I was in school 50 years ago, and they weren't prepared to teach me. So it's not that diversity is new. It's just that it's become much more visible. Many have received little coursework, few relevant readings, and almost no experiences in the kinds of schools that they're be most likely to teach in, that is, urban schools populated by African American, Latino and Latina, Asian American, and American Indian students, as well as students of immigrant and refugee backgrounds from every corner of the globe, many of whom do not speak English. So another reality is that most teachers, specifically about 83%, are white, monolingual English speaking, and they're middle class. And the numbers of administrators, guidance counselors, and other school professionals are almost as high or even higher in some cases. So even more importantly, many of these professionals have had little personal or professional experience with diversity. On top of that, a number of surveys have found that most teachers, or new teachers, feel unprepared to teach today's students, particularly language minority students and those with special needs. Even more troubling is the fact that many prospective teachers expect, and this has been found in survey after survey, expect and want to teach in schools such as the ones that they attended as children. That is, white, middle-class schools with English-speaking children. But that is far from what will happen, because these are precisely the children who they will not be teaching. They will be teaching children of diverse backgrounds who speak a variety of languages and come from different social classes. So what does it take to be a culturally responsive teacher? In addition to the attributes that I've already mentioned, being culturally responsive means to be a sociocultural mediator. That is, it means to learn who their students are, to honor their students' identities rather than try to erase them, to make connections with families, to have high expectations in spite of the conventional wisdom about their students' abilities, and to provide a robust curriculum that gives students options in life. I'll be saying much more about these, all of these in a few minutes. But I want to focus on Mary Ginley, who's not in my new book, but was a student of mine many years ago and has just retired last year after 42 years in the classroom. She was also Massachusetts Teacher of the Year about 10 or 12 years ago. Wonderful teacher. So she put it best in a journal entry that she wrote for one of my classes many years ago, and that's actually in the book, The Light in Their Eyes. She wrote, "Our responsibility is to meet them where they are and take them someplace else." That's what good teachers do. But even more important, and this is what it means to be a cultural mediator, and have them have them carry who they are along with them. And that's the part that's missing in too many cases. While many teachers are good at meeting their students where they are and taking them someplace else, it takes a culturally responsive teacher to encourage students to carry who they are along with them. For me, this is a perfect definition of a culturally responsive teacher, because it's a person who acknowledges and affirms students' identities, who understands that they already have an identity, and that while at the same time offering them a range of dreams and possibilities through an inclusive, demanding curriculum. Ay, ay, ay. So this is hard work, I know. And it's my hope that those of you who are teachers and other educators, and those of you who hope to become teachers and other kinds of educators, will realize that the work is well worth it. So I want to talk with you this evening about the qualities of culturally responsive teachers and give you some examples. So I want to focus on 5 specific qualities of culturally responsive teachers that I've discovered in my work with teachers, particularly from my forthcoming book, which is called Finding Joy in Teaching Students of Diverse Backgrounds. I decided to give it that title because I think that joy is what's missing, and that often when teachers are assigned to schools with kids of diverse backgrounds, kids living in poverty, kids who, who represent many different challenges, that they sort of throw up their hands and say, oh no, instead of relishing the possibility and saying, what can I do here? So I looked for teachers who find joy in teaching students of diverse backgrounds. So these are some of the things that I want to mention today, these qualities. Valuing language and culture, insisting on high quality and excellent work from all students, honoring students' families, exemplifying a commitment to lifelong learning, and engaging in critical reflection. So the first thing I want to focus on is valuing language and culture. This is Maricela Mesa, an elementary bilingual teacher in Los Angeles. So the teachers, I have 22 teachers that I focused on, and they're from all over the country. And Maricela happens to be one of a group of teachers, and I'll just tell you a little story about this. The way that I got the teachers to interview, for the most part, was when I'm asked to speak in different places, I ask the people who invite me, I did ask the people who invited me, to put me in touch with a teacher who finds joy in teaching students of diverse backgrounds and who's thriving. So when I came out to Loyola Marymount about 4 or 5 years ago, Magali Labadens, Professor Labadens, invited me, and I asked her if she would recommend someone, and she said, I can't do that. I said, why? She said, because I have too many. I can't just tell you about one. So we invited 8 of the teachers, and I interviewed them together, sort of as a focus group, and Maricela was one of them. So for culturally responsive teachers, the students' personal backgrounds and their voices are seen as a rich resource for the curriculum, rather than thinking of them as deficits. Right? When I went to school, I didn't speak English. I wish my teachers had said, aren't we lucky, we have a child here who speaks Spanish. But no, they said, poor thing, she doesn't speak English. It depends on how you frame it, right? So that's because, teachers who are culturally responsive recognize that students' language and culture are valuable in their own right. So of course all teachers and all educational professionals use culture in their curriculum and pedagogy. They all do. But if they're from the majority culture, they might be unaware that they're using cultural references because it's like the fish in the water that doesn't recognize the environment that it's in. It's just normal, right? So those cultural references are normal, but for children from other cultural backgrounds, they may not be. So the difference with being culturally responsive is that this kind of work is done with teachers whose language and culture are often invisible in the curriculum. It's purposeful, and it's done with specific goals in mind: to affirm who students are in order to have them connect with school, to accept and relish who they are, and to succeed academically. So Maricela, one of the youngest teachers I interviewed for this project, is a good example of how her own experience as an immigrant helped her become a culturally responsive teacher. Look at that face, right? Arriving in the United States from Mexico as a fluent Spanish speaker but speaking no English, she had the desire to succeed in her new country with a new language. But not having the linguistic or material resources at home to help her, it was teachers who gave her, she said, quote, a helping hand that allowed me to be myself and be successful. Now again, culturally responsive, to be myself and be successful. It's not an either or. And she continued and said, I owe many of my successes to those teachers who took time out of their regular day to provide that support that I couldn't find at home due to the limited English skills at home. But I think just that passion that I was able to get from those teachers, just doing it voluntarily, just because they wanted to help, not because there was any compensation. They wanted to help. I feel that I am because I retain my native language and because of those teachers who were there, dedicated, who always cared about what I was going to become. So I hope I can become that teacher, not just for one student, but for every student that takes part in my classroom. So what about teachers and other educators who don't share the students' language and culture? Because they're also responsible for all of our children. Can they also become that teacher to their students? The answer is not only that they can, but that they must become that teacher. It is possible to become that teacher, but it takes the will and humility to learn who their students are and to respect their students' identities. So here's an example. This is Amber Bouchard, a middle school language arts teacher in Plainfield, Illinois. Amber had been a kindergarten teacher in an elite private school in Massachusetts when she appeared at my door one day pleading with me to allow her into my oversubscribed course in multicultural education. She needed it desperately, she said, because her husband's company had relocated him to Chicago, and she knew she'd be teaching students of diverse backgrounds and didn't know where to begin. Of course I let her in the class. Amber was an exceptional student and an exceptional teacher. Whether she's teaching kindergarten in an elite private school or, as she is now, language arts in a very diverse middle school. And to give you an idea of the diversity, her school has 32 languages represented. What she didn't realize at the time, but soon learned, was that it wasn't only teachers working in urban areas who needed multicultural education, but all teachers working with all kinds of students. She became not just knowledgeable about multicultural education, but also an extraordinarily enthusiastic proponent of its value for all students, regardless of background, having since completed a doctoral degree in multicultural education. And she continues as a school teacher, a 7th grade language arts teacher. Amber put this philosophy into practice immediately, though, but even before she moved to Chicago, in her kindergarten classroom, saying, it was really relevant to my all-white kindergarten class. I remember doing this color study where I had the kids paint the color of their skin. They were making little quilt pictures of themselves, and they had to mix paint colors, and they started talking about, you know, we're not really all the same color, are we? We're all different colors. And this was all white students. So imagine then, you know, what you can do with students of a range of backgrounds. The course in multicultural education exposed her, she said, to this, quote, this concept of affirming each person where they are and who they are, and getting to know students as individuals and families as individuals, and bringing these conversations up in the classroom. So in her new urbanized suburb of Plainfield, armed with her new knowledge and having begun to speak with her students, colleagues, and families about issues of privilege and diversity and race, in her previous kindergarten class, she felt ready to tackle the issue at her new school. She talked about how in the course she had taken with me, we discussed issues of race, power, privilege, and difference. And it was revealing to her, she said. I just needed someone to say, you don't have to be black to do this. A wonderful insight. And yet I know that a lot of white teachers feel very uncomfortable because they have to broach these issues of diversity, and yet, if not them, who? You know. I needed you to say, it's okay if you don't know it. It's okay for me that I grew up in a relatively privileged life, or that I might have experienced, I didn't realize it at the time, but I might have experienced poverty. She was actually one of 13 kids in a blended family. And she thought she was privileged, but she found out later that she really wasn't. Except that she was white. She had white privilege, and that's something that she started realizing. So being willing to talk about our differences and value our differences is very, very important. Amber's a teacher who wants to know everything she can about her students. She wants to be able to learn about them by finding out who they are, what's important to them, and where they want to go. And as she said, she wants to find out, what do you dream? What do you want to learn? And she has wonderful stories of how she connects with her students of different backgrounds. So, about valuing language and culture, what can administrators do? Well, they can provide meaningful professional development. Not only whole auditorium presentations, they don't really work very well. Not prepackaged courses. Not presentations that are meant to perpetuate stereotypes and get teachers and principals off the hook, like the so-called culture of poverty workshops that are done all over the place, that place children of color at a disadvantage and in a very patronizing way, right? So that then teachers and administrators can say, oh, well, you know, that's their culture, I can't do anything about it, you know. Demonstrate support for diversity of all kinds throughout the building and in school policies and practices. One of the teachers, I hope I have time for this story because I love this story. One of the teachers who I worked with extensively is Mary Cowie. I mentioned her book before when we were having dinner. She wrote a wonderful book called Black Ants and Buddhists, and I recommend it highly. It's about early childhood, but it's good for everybody. And really, it's about her life in her classroom in first and second grade. But anyway, when she was my master's student, she did an action project where Mary speaks Spanish. She knows a lot about the Civil Rights Movement and African American history because she made it her business to learn these things. She had been a community organizer for 16 years before becoming a teacher. And so then in my class she said, you know, I've decided I want to do something about sexual orientation because I don't know as much as I should know. So she did this action project that luckily she works with a principal and colleagues who she says say, uh-oh, here she comes with more energy, more ideas. And she went to the principal and said, you know, I don't think that we do enough in our school about sexual orientation. And we have a number of families that are headed by lesbians or by gay men, and we need to know, you know, so that we can be affirming and accepting to these families. This is a K through 6 school. So she did this project, and it included all sorts of things. But one of the things that most struck me was that they then started taking pictures. When families came to register the kids or when they would come to drop them off, they took pictures of every family so that when you walked into the school, there were 300 photographs of families that you don't have to say a word. All you have to do is look at the families, and they tell a story. They are diverse racially, ethnically, in terms of composition, and how many generations, the genders, and so on. And they did professional development with teachers on how to be more accepting and welcoming of families, of gay and lesbian-headed families. And the final thing that they did, which was very gutsy at the time, I'm talking like 12 years ago, is that they marched in the Gay Pride Parade in their town with a banner from the school. That first year, it was the principal, Mary, a few parents, and a few kids. And now it's a whole contingent that does that. So that's what administrators can do. Okay, next, insisting on high quality and excellent work from all students. You know, when teachers insist on high quality work, this is an indisputable message that they care about them and that they believe that they are capable and worthy. It's this combination of high standards and caring that's really often missing from the standards movement. And it's an important lesson we can learn from Jeffrey Winokur. Jeffrey teaches at the Parkway Northwest High School for Peace and Social Justice in Philadelphia, a public school, where almost all his students are African American, with some Afro-Caribbean, Latino, and a few biracial students in the mix. He teaches English and humanities courses as well as a course called Leadership and Social Development. Because he has a special interest in African literature and film, he's incorporated these interests into his courses, most of which are interdisciplinary in nature. He's a demanding teacher, never using textbooks. He says that the students breathe a sigh of relief when he tells them this. But instead, he selects books that can be read at both the high school and the college levels. Now remember, he teaches only African American and Latino, mostly, and some African students. Students that have been dismissed by so many other schools as having been, as being able to even read these texts. He uses some college texts with them. And he's even taught graduate level books to his 11th and 12th graders. And he explains this by saying, to me, they can do it. It's just giving them the context, allowing them a context in which they can do things that they can do. He continues, then when I tell them that I'm going to teach them how to read these books, that I'm going to teach them how to read them, not that just that we're going to read them, I think they like that. I think that when they're allowed to talk and express themselves, I think they really like that. At the same time, Jeffrey is close to his students. He's the kind of teacher defined by researchers Jacqueline Irvine and James Fraser as, quote, warm demanders. That is, teachers who are unrelenting in their demands while also being nurturing and loving. This quote of Jeffrey's really expresses it well. He said, I feel like my relationship, I will say I feel it has to be based on love, really. What that means is sometimes very joyful and sometimes not. I try as much as I can. I try to think of them like how would I treat them if they were my own kids, which sometimes means they need a hug and sometimes they need a knock upside the head, so to speak. And so I really try to develop an individual relationship with each kid. So what can administrators do? Trust teachers. That's my primary message. I think teachers are so untrusted so often. Trust teachers and other education professionals, like paraprofessionals and guidance counselors. One of the teachers who I interviewed for my book was a paraprofessional when I interviewed her. And I just heard from her recently. She finished community college, which I knew. When I met her, she was in college. She has since finished. She's now a fully certified teacher and is applying to graduate school. She's a woman who never expected to go beyond high school. An African American woman who became a hairdresser. But then she started, a friend of hers said, come, let's be paraprofessionals. I'm doing it. I bet you'll like it. And that's how it started for her. So I think looking at all these professionals and providing them with autonomy to experiment, to create and collaborate, and to understand that standards don't necessarily require standardization. You can have high standards without having standardization. So encourage them to go, not to go beyond. Encourage them to go beyond the standards and even to question the standards. I think that's an important part of what the standards should be about. Okay, honoring families. So why should educators honor families? To some, this might seem to be excessively intrusive or even disingenuous. After all, families already know they should be involved in school matters, don't they? They already know that their involvement with and support of their children's education makes a difference, don't they? Not really, and not always. Not all families know these things, and this is often the case because if they're immigrants, for example, in their home countries, school matters are for schools to take care of, and family matters are handled by families. In other cases, families may know that they're expected to be involved in school, but they may feel nervous, embarrassed, or disrespected if they show up. As a child, I can assure you that my parents avoided coming into the school at whatever cost. Luckily, my sister and I were, quote, good kids, and teachers never summoned my parents to school for misbehavior. So it means many things to culturally responsive teachers. It means regularly communicating with the families of their students, respecting and admiring them, and learning from them. It doesn't mean filling them with knowledge. It means understanding that they have knowledge that they can fill teachers' heads with. You know, it's a reciprocal process. It also means creating a sense of family in the classroom. So in addition to honoring students' culture and language, the teachers I interviewed at Loyola Marymount University, who are all bilingual and ESL teachers, insist that all families and communities have strengths. Rather than viewing their students' families as uneducated and disinterested in education, they recognize that education is a strong value in the Latino community, that immigrant families understand only too well that education is the only way that their children may have a chance at a better life than their own. And in fact, in the interview, one of the teachers was saying that, you know what, one of their roles, and it's an onerous role to have to fulfill, and yet it's a role that all of us, I think, have to take on, is that they have to educate other teachers in the school. So here they are, bilingual teachers, but they are educating other teachers, because when they hear other teachers say things like, well, the parents don't really care about education because they never come up to school. You know, and this teacher said, you know what? This was us. This was our parents. I mean, our kids' families, they work in the hospital, they work at the airport, they have all these night jobs, they work in hotels. They are killing themselves for their kids. So how can they say they don't care about education? So these teachers have, you know, an important role to play. So this is one of those teachers, Carmen Alcázar. She's a teacher in the Montebello United School District in East LA, and she's been a teacher for 18 years in the dual language enrichment program. She's a firm believer in the benefits of community circle for her students, even when administrators see it as wasting valuable learning time. Here's what she writes about her experience with it. She just wrote me recently, last week, because she's always done community circle, but her principal doesn't feel that it's so important. It's like a waste of time. And you all know what community circle is, right? Where you, oh, sorry. Okay, when the kids get together, have a community meeting in the morning, and they share what's happening in their lives and in their families. So that's community circle. It's to develop a sense of community among the kids. So she wrote to me and said, my principal requested I stop the circles as she didn't see the academic value of it. That's because of all the, you know, the testing craze that we're in now, unfortunately. So she writes, ironically, early this year, a young woman who had been my third grade student 14 years ago entered my classroom at the end of the day. After we caught up for a few hours, she asked me if I still did community circle. I told her I did it secretly, as our principal didn't think favorably on it. She then went on to disclose very personal events that she was experiencing at home during third grade. I asked her why she never shared her problems, and her response floored me. She said she didn't want me to think less of her. As my model student, my right hand in class, she didn't want to lose that. But she also said that when it came to community circle, while she listened to other students' problems, she would silently share hers. This made her feel better, and she anticipated community circle each week. So Carmen continues, I can't tell you how much I cried that day with my former student. This young woman is now a senior at California State Dominguez Hills, where she is studying to be a third grade teacher. So Carmen concluded this email to me by writing, I will not compromise my community circle time, no matter what is asked of me. My students and I need it, and in some cases, it's the only lifeline they have. So what can guidance counselors and principals do? I think encourage all sorts of community building practices in the classroom, such as community circle, such as, you know, coffee time with families, to make the school parent friendly. I taught in the first bilingual school in the Northeast, which was in the Bronx. I was a fourth grade teacher there. And parent outreach was so important that we had a parent room, and it was placed right next to the principal's office. So that said something about how important it was. To encourage home visits, we were just talking about this in our during dinner. Yes, I think home visits are really, really important, crucial if teachers are to learn who their students are. Although I understand that middle and high school teachers couldn't possibly do it with all the students who they have, but there are other ways of keeping in touch with families, and that's what they should do. And to provide meaningful professional development. I keep saying that in all of these things because that's so important, and yet so much is missing. For example, what is meaningful professional development? You know, I've been thinking lately that taking the staff of a school to walk around the neighborhood is meaningful professional development. Because so many teachers and other professionals in the school don't know what the community even looks like. They don't know what it has to offer. They just know they go there at 9, they leave at 3. They don't know anything about it except maybe some stereotypes about it, and you know, they often don't live in the community, and that's okay. But at least get to know the resources in that community, because often there are rich resources. Commitment to lifelong learning. This is John Wynn, and he is an amazing teacher. He was inspired by his grandfather, a chemistry teacher in Vietnam, and he decided in 8th grade that he too wanted to be a teacher. By this time, he and his family had arrived in the United States, and they were living in Danbury, Connecticut. When I interviewed him, he had been teaching civics and social studies for 11 years in New Haven, the last 8 at James Hillhouse High School. With about 900 students, Hillhouse has a population that's about 80% African American, 90% Latino, and 1%, quote, other. Some white kid got in there, I think, you know, maybe an Asian, I don't know. But one of only 2 schools in the city that's not designated as a magnet school. It's a default choice for most of the students. So John said, you know, if you don't get into all the other schools, you sort of indirectly come to our school. At the beginning of his time at Hillhouse, John was severely tested by his students. I mean, look at the racial differences and tensions and conflicts that there have been between Asians and African Americans, Asians, Latinos. He said that some of first of all, his class sizes were extremely large. He had one class that had 55 students, although it was supposed to have no more than 27. And there were also discipline problems, he said, and he recalled that he was called awful things. But that isn't the case anymore. John has close relationships with his students. He's a very beloved teacher, an excellent and even an award-winning teacher. He won the Milken Award in Connecticut the year before I met him. So it should be noted, however, that in spite of the difficulties that he had, John persevered because he had purposely chosen to teach in New Haven precisely because of the diversity. He didn't, he said, want to teach in a homogeneous school like most of Connecticut. Still, he laughed. He said, well, I guess my school is pretty homogeneous African American and Latino. But he wanted the diversity, he said. That was the environment that he wanted to teach in because, as he explained, I wanted an area where I could make a lot of impact and change, preferring, he said, to teach the students for the most part that have been neglected. He's an incredibly enthusiastic learner. I think we could all learn from him. Learning is his lifelong pursuit. He said about learning to be a teacher, you won't believe this, at the age of 13, when he was in 8th grade, he began by immersing himself in the kinds of learning experiences that he knew would serve him well as a teacher. It was the summer of Tiananmen Square, and shortly thereafter the Berlin Wall came down. These were eye-opening events for John. He mused, it's one of the first times I realized there's a world outside of Connecticut and they're fighting for what I took for granted, which was democracy. He continued his self-education in high school and through college at the University of Connecticut. Years later, he went to both China and Germany, visits that have strengthened his teaching. In high school and completely on his own, he volunteered for the AIDS Quilt Project in Connecticut, and he was the only high school student in the whole state to do so. Continuing his community service learning in high school, he volunteered for both Habitat for Humanity and Amnesty International. During college, he took a year off to join AmeriCorps, which really upset his parents because they were afraid that he wouldn't go back to school. But as he said, I wanted to be a teacher, so of course I was going to go back to school. He was just doing these things to get more experience that would help him be a better teacher. So during his year with AmeriCorps, he worked on cleaning up the floods in New Orleans, setting up a teen center in Baltimore, and releasing fish in the streams of New England. Because of his work with AmeriCorps, he and his peers were invited to the White House on 2 occasions. He said, "I knew that all of those experiences would make me better. I knew I was going to be a teacher, but I didn't know what kind of teacher, and AmeriCorps really showed me that I wanted to be a social studies teacher." Still thinking of himself as a student, John continues to learn all he can to bring knowledge back to his students. He believes strongly that learning is a lifelong journey and that it can happen anywhere. He said that his best years in college, quote, were the years away from it. Because he received academic credit for doing an internship with, as a college student, the National Council for the Social Studies in Washington, D.C., and for going to Vietnam with his geography professor. He also studied in London, afterwards traveling throughout Europe for several months. Even then, teaching was in the forefront of his mind. He said, "I knew that wherever I went, I was going to teach, and I just learned as much as I could to bring it back to the classroom." When John was already a teacher and 5 months after Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf, he went to New Orleans during his February break to work with Habitat for Humanity. After his week in New Orleans, he created a PowerPoint presentation for his students. And as he said, "This was another example when I encouraged my students to continue to grow as people in order to become not only better students, but more importantly, better people." This is a single-minded focus on learning. Hi, Concho. There. Okay, so what can principals do and other educators? They can create academically challenging learning opportunities, both curricular and extracurricular, because sometimes the extracurricular ones are the ones that keep kids in school. They can provide students with opportunities to, quote, become better people through school and community-related activities. So, for example, in Jeffrey Winokur's school, they have a teacher whose sole job is to place students in community service learning activities. So they learn from an early age to do things outside of school. And again, to provide meaningful professional development. So finally, engaging in critical self-reflection. This is Roger Wallace. Culturally responsive educators realize that before they can create a learner-centered curriculum, they need to figure out who they are and where they fit into the picture. They need to know themselves. This means critical self-reflection about issues that are sometimes quite difficult to face. This is Roger Wallace, who exemplifies what it means to reflect critically. A veteran teacher, he was the only African-American male teacher in his school for 39 years. He retired last year, and we've just set up, he's from my hometown, we've just set up an award named after Roger, because he's been such a phenomenal teacher for so many years. And it's for an elementary school teacher every year. Now, Roger hadn't originally planned to become a teacher, but instead a juvenile justice lawyer. He always loved working with kids, he said, and he did well in his law boards and gained admission to the University of Virginia, one of the finest law schools. But he abandoned the idea of law after he became hooked on teaching in his senior year of college, when he had an internship in an after-school program in the city of Worcester, Massachusetts. He found the work so rewarding that he thought, quote, "Where can I work with a body of kids before they get into a great deal of trouble?" He realized, he said, that it had to be in a school. So immediately after graduating, he became a teacher. Roger believes there's no greater calling than teaching, and as a black man, he says that he has certain responsibilities. Part of his cultural legacy, he says, is to accept all children for who they are, rather than what he or anyone else expects them to be. He explained, for instance, that some white teachers expect children of color to be just like the white kids. And he said, "Look, it ain't gonna work. They ain't never gonna be white. Can you teach them as they are instead of I'll teach them when they become what I want them to be, and then they'll be ready to learn?" They're ready to learn. They need to learn now. So, advice for teachers, he said, and this is one of, I think, the best pieces of advice that have in the whole book. If you want to be a successful teacher of children of diverse backgrounds, put your stuff away. Put your stuff away. Beautiful. So it's one of the sagest pieces of advice that I heard in the interviews. Putting your stuff away is about listening to students and learning from them and discarding any negative preconceptions and biases and untested assumptions about them. It's recognizing that everyone harbors biases. But he nevertheless encourages teachers to walk into a classroom with fresh eyes and an open heart, as he said. He also said something about parent engagement. He said, I don't expect parents to necessarily come to school. He said, look, if I know a parent goes to the laundromat on Thursday, I'll show up on Thursday at the laundromat with clean hands and the ability to fold everything, willingness to fold everything except the underwear. And that's when I meet with the family, with the parent. So that kind of flexibility, that kind of reflection is really, really important. So what can principals and other educators do? They, don't fall for deficit perspectives. Rather than saying, these parents are not interested, they're not going to come and meet with me because little Johnny has been misbehaving. No, find where they do want to go. Find where they go. Go to the laundromat. Go and meet them where they are. I should also say that Roger never misses one of his students' events. He said, even even ballet performances that I don't particularly like, but I love them when my students are in them. So, that's what it means to be a culturally responsive teacher. Also encouraging courageous conversations or hard talk, which is courageous conversations about race, ethnicity, privilege, power. All of these things have to be part of one's education and hopefully part of what goes on in a school. It doesn't happen in too many schools, but it needs to happen in more. Supporting culturally responsive. Oh, I wanted to say something about deficit perspectives, about not falling for deficit perspectives. And I often remember, for example, my own sister was told that she wasn't, quote, college material by a guidance counselor. She ended up going to college, which she didn't want to do until she was told that. And then she decided to apply for college. And she ended up getting her master's in special education, bilingual special education. So those deficit perspectives get in the way. Sometimes they spur people on to do something, but that isn't often the case. She happens to be stubborn. So, supporting cultural responsiveness, and I've mentioned all of these things already. But before concluding, I want to remind us that we need to acknowledge that no teacher and even no guidance counselor, principal, or administrator can do it alone. Yet we're living in a time when teachers are blamed for everything, from student test scores to greed of all things, and when teacher bashing has become a national pastime. There was a brief respite after the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre, and the heroism of the teachers became apparent, but for the most part, teachers are just blamed for so many things all the time. So our society remains harshly unequal, and it provides few resources for the students who need them most. And blaming students and teachers for the failure of students to learn is not going to solve the problem. While this is the case, we'll continue to have what is called the achievement gap, which I don't like that term. I prefer to call it the resource gap, or the opportunity gap, or the caring gap. Until we demonstrate that we care for all our students, until we honor teaching as the noble profession that it is. Even such exemplary teachers as those that I featured today will have a hard time of it. This means making substantive change beyond the classroom and the school, and demanding that our entire society, including our cities, towns, states, and the federal government, also change their policies and practices to do the things that I've recommended that teachers and principals and guidance counselors and other educators need to do, because they can't do it alone. Because if we really, truly care about public education, if we believe that all students deserve every chance, if we are honest about the United States being the land of opportunity, we have to do better. And we can start by learning from teachers such as those that I've spoken with you about this evening. In this era of high-stakes testing and rigid accountability, they remind us that some things simply cannot be measured.
So we're going to take questions from the audience, and I understand we have Dr. Harding facilitating at Encino, and who's at Irvine? The students at Irvine. Okay, so we have here from the audience at Encino and Irvine. So
I have a question here. When you try, for example, to study who the students are and to study their background, the cultural background, did you include in any studies the religious background and what effect it has on the teacher preparation, basically, to accommodate all these various faiths, in the classroom, for example, and the sensitivity to their, beliefs, and values?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you recommend that teachers now take any class, for example, like about world religions and study the value system of each, faith, so that they can be better prepared to face the students in the classroom?
Yeah, I definitely would. I think it's really important that that teachers learn everything that they can about their students that they can use in their teaching. And so, for example, in our previous conversation at dinner, we were talking about the case studies that I did for my book, Affirming Diversity, and those case studies from the beginning included an Arab American student, who was Catholic, actually, Lebanese, Christian rather, a Jewish student, and later we added Arab American students who were Muslim, because I think that that's really important. Their worldview is shaped by, for some people, for some students, it's shaped by religion, and people need to know that. So yes, I absolutely think that that's important. That's why I love Luis Moll's work. What he does is send his students out to interview families. And when they interview families, they learn that families have so much to offer, instead of thinking that they have nothing, And so they also get to understand who the students are and where they're coming from. So yeah, it's very important. That's one of the differences that I think, we need to always keep in mind. For some people, religion is not important. For many people, it is. Yes. Oh.
Early on in the talk, you spoke about how 50 years ago the education system wasn't ready to teach you. So understanding that idea that maybe the system isn't culturally relevant, as a culturally relevant educator or somebody who's trying to do that, what role do we have in changing the actual education system to become itself more culturally relevant? Because we can do that in our classroom, but if the content that we're asked to teach, either through Common Core that's coming up or whatever state standard that we use, isn't culturally relevant, and we are in the push towards a value-added model, how do we change that, or how can we actually take part in writing that curriculum to change that?
Well, let's take the issue of the Common Core, for example. The Common Core does not mandate the content. It mandates the standards. And so there's a lot of leeway there. And, I'm not saying that I'm a big fan of the Common Core, but I think that you can, there are ways to work within it. What I don't like about it is the tests that are coming and all of that. But in terms of the content itself, I think that teachers self-censor before they even are given something. They say, oh, well, I can't do that. And that's not the case with the Common Core. And even with standards sometimes. Mary Cowie, who I mentioned before, that first and second grade teacher, she says, oh, I follow the standards. The standards say that children in second grade need to know about national monuments. Yeah, so I just don't teach them about the Washington Memorial and the Lincoln, or the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. Yeah, maybe, I'll teach them about that, but I also teach them about monuments from the civil rights era that otherwise they wouldn't get. Now, the standards don't say to include them, but they don't say not to include them. So you have to be a little daring. You have to always push beyond the limits. Yes, what were you going to say?
So, like, I understand what you're saying, but if there is, we've all, like, in California, there's the blueprints, right? And it tells you what things are weighted, and certain things, or at least in the where we're at now, certain things are weighted, and they're not necessarily always culturally relevant. So if you look at, say, U.S. history standards, for example, civil rights are weighted, but it's only a few things. And so if you're following a pacing plan in one of the charter schools or CMOs that are really popular now, that are like blowing tests out of the water, you're only expected to cover civil rights in like 2 weeks. And so much of your pay now is covered to that. So, like, how do you then resist that and change that dynamic so you're not always having to follow that? On top of that, like standardized tests, the idea being that inherently they can be biased in certain respects.
Yeah, I was going to say spill it.
Yeah, well, they can be very racist in certain respects, right?
Racist.
So how can we then change that if so much of what's coming on is based on those tests that could be racist to some of the students that we're talking about?
Right.
Be it linguistically or culturally, they don't have the capital to be able to pass those.
Well, teachers are also activists and advocates. Teaching is advocacy, and teaching is political work. So whether you do it in your classroom, which you always do every single day, whether you think you're doing political work or not, you're doing political work, because you're taking a stand one way or the other about something. And so, but it also means getting out of the classroom. And so I would say join a union and make the union more responsive to these things. Join organizations, go to conferences, write. There are lots of ways to be an advocate. And people need to find their own way in doing that, but teaching is advocacy. And that's a reality that maybe some people don't like, but it's true. It's true. And it's political work, because teaching says something about what we think of the world and who we think deserve anything, So there are lots of ways, and so I would encourage everybody to think of ways that they can be involved in changing things. And I have some hope. I've seen some changes happening. I've seen people taking a stand, and I've seen, like the teachers in Seattle who refused to give the test. There are things that can be done, and I think that's what we need to focus on, what can be done. Paulo Freire, there's a wonderful quote of his that says, we don't need to worry about whether we can change things, but how we can, to what extent we can. We can always do something. Yes.
Dr. Nieto, thank you very much for the engaging stories you shared from the teachers and the information that you shared about how educators and site-level administrators can be responsive. And I was wondering if you've done any research or if you might have suggestions concerning how administrators in education at the federal or the state level or even the district, like a superintendent level, might become more culturally responsive, or how we can get the word out to them about cultural responsiveness.
I haven't done research with superintendents and district personnel, but I think it's more or less the same thing. I mean, teachers, like administrators, also need to become lifelong learners. They need to be, as Roger said, go in with an open heart and an open mind, learn from the people around them, affirm the language and culture of the students and of the community. It means educating those administrators. That's really what it means, educating them. So get some books and, give them out on, subscribe to Rethinking Schools, give them those things. I mean, I think that a lot of times, I know I have written for journals that principals read, like Educational Leadership and others, and I've had to learn how to write for those things, because they say, well, this is for administrators, so you have to write short paragraphs, and you have to not use too many. You have to not use too many references. They don't have time to read, you know. But it means getting them information, you know. But I think that's a hard nut to crack. But that doesn't mean that it can't be done, you know. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how standardization and a lack of culturally diverse teaching affects diverse learners?
You know, I think standardization and a lack of culturally responsive pedagogy affects every learner, not just students of diverse backgrounds. Of course, all students are students of diverse backgrounds. So it affects all students. You know, it gives us a warped view of reality. It gives students a warped view of reality, as if things only happen in one way, as if history was only one person's telling of it, as if, you know, so I think it affects everybody in a negative way. You know, it prioritizes some kinds of learning and not other kinds of learning. That's certainly true with the high stakes environment that we're in right now. You know, one of the teachers who I interviewed for my book said, you know, we don't just want people who can answer questions on Jeopardy, you know, and who are like, you know, no, we want humanistic people. We want people who can get along in the world. We want people who will take care of the environment, who will take care of one another. You know, it affects us all when we have this push towards standardization and accountability to such an extent that we lose sight of what education is really about. You know, that's why I put joy in the title of my book, because it's been drained out of so much of teaching today and of education in general.
Hi, I'm a student studying to be a teacher in a classroom finally after doing community education for 10 years. And on every job description, it's clear that cultural competency is a must. And I'm surprised that I don't see the demand in print for it. I've been really lucky to grow up going to a public school system where I experienced diversity and didn't realize what a homogeneous environment was really until I was an adult. Now, you know, I'm in a situation where this is kind of the most diversity I've experienced in terms of studying with younger, some more privileged students who really have grown up in a private school setting, and I see that they're really lucky to have faculty who are teaching about this, whether or not it's demanded. Why are we making this something so confusing? Why
esoteric?
Right. Why can't this be demystified? Why aren't we finding a more strategic, formal approach to saying you need to learn to see through different lenses?
Yeah. You know why? Because we have a testing culture in place that's getting in the way. I think that's a huge part of it. And I also think that old habits die hard. And for people who have not experienced diversity, who may be afraid of it, who are so immersed in their own privilege that they can't see beyond it, this is hard. And so we have to shake them out of that privilege and, you know, have them understand that, look, this is the world today. So I think that there is a lot of verbal support for cultural responsiveness, but in terms of actually getting it into the classroom, into the school, it's hard because of a lot of different factors. Hopefully, you know, courses that are taught in at the pre-practicum and the post-BA, you know, for the masters and so on, it will become more like breathing, you know. But right now it isn't. It isn't, and there's still some resistance, quite a bit of resistance.
Hi, you spoke about the deficit perspectives, but I wanted to talk about the deficit ideologies. And do you think the deficit ideologies define the culture of minority students? And how can you become culturally competent on a group of minority students who are unaware of their own culture?
Who are unaware of their own culture. Okay. Well, we had sort of a similar question before. Yeah. Yeah. That, I think that we need to be careful how we define culture. If we define culture as something bounded and, everybody who's African American is like this, everybody who's Vietnamese is like this, everybody who's white is like this, then we get into trouble. I remember an email I got years ago that made me laugh. It was funny, it was cute, and it was, you're Puerto Rican when, and then all this funny stuff, like your mother used to chase you around the house with a slipper, with a chancleta, when every meal has to have rice and beans in it, when you can, and so, real stereotypes. But I read that and felt, wow, my kids wouldn't be in here at all, Oh, there was one, that Vicks Vapor Rub is the magic cure for everything. So it was in my family. My kids wouldn't know what Vicks Vapor Rub was. Culture changes all the time. It changes all the time. That's why I gave that example before of drinking Manischewitz wine at Thanksgiving every year. That became part of Puerto Rican culture, this Jewish wine, which was really funny. So, we have to define culture as a living, breathing, changing kind of thing. And if that's the case, I think kids are aware of their culture. But they may harbor those deficit views because that's what they've heard all their lives. Maybe not at home, but, in school and in other, in society. And so I think the role of teachers is to focus on having students learn about their history. It all goes back to the history. What is the history? How could young African Americans learn about the civil rights movement and not be filled with pride? That's some important legacy, right? I remember what's her name, Virginia Sanchez Coro wrote a book about the Puerto Rican community from the beginning of the 20th century to the mid-20th century. And the conventional wisdom was that the Puerto Rican community hadn't really organized, that they didn't have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of community organizations and so on. And she did this research that blew that out of the water. And I thought, wow, look at everything that people have done, that I didn't know about because I never learned it in school. So it's uncovering that history that really is an important part of the role of teachers, no matter what they teach, because it's not only about history and social studies, it's the history of art, for example. It's the history of social movements, it's the history, well, that's social studies too, but it's the history of religion, it's the history of everything that we can think of that we have gotten such a limited view of, that of course kids are going to think, well, my people have done nothing because we're not in the history books. So I think we have to just broaden our view of what culture really is.
I'd like to ask you about sexuality. So here in California, there's been a law that was passed to implement or talk about LGBT people in the history books, and LA Unified also passed a bill within the school district to also incorporate LGBT people. Currently, I'm one of the chairs of the LGBT group within our union, and we have teachers who come to our meetings every month who voice that their administration is telling them not to teach about LGBT, or that it would be an obstacle in the community that they work in. So how can we overcome those obstacles to teach the students that there are other people out there that they also can identify with.
Okay, so it's the law now, right? So then you say, this is the law. It's the law. I mean, you're lucky that you at least have that. In a lot of places they don't have that, and so then it's much harder because people say, well, it's against our religion, or it's, as if talking about LGBT issues is about sex, which it isn't. It's about civil rights. And so I think that's the focus that we need to take. This is about civil rights and inclusion. How could we not include this, a broader spectrum of people, of diverse backgrounds and experiences? So it also means to me that there must be a real focus on professional development. When Mary Cowie, who I told you did this action research where they did all this stuff, including marching in the Gay Pride Parade, that was not an easy thing to do, and now to become part of the culture of the school. I mean, every teacher experienced that video, It's Elementary. Do you know it? Yeah. I mean, it's old by now. There's probably newer stuff, but it was groundbreaking at the time. That was 10, 12 years ago. And so professional development, meaningful professional development is an important part of getting people to move. We're educators. That's what we do. So it's about education.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on advising high schools and high school teachers on the prevalence of the drug culture in high schools and how that affects all of us in our teaching.
Not really. I don't want to take on everything because I'm not, that's not part of my work. I can just say that, I understand that it is a very difficult issue. Having children and grandchildren myself, I know that. That's all I can say about that. Yeah. Yes?
Speaking of cultural awareness that you raised a minute ago, speaking about the cultural awareness that our colleague here mentioned, I have attended recently a conference at UCLA for minority schools, weekend schools, and also weekly programs. And there was a case, for example, of an Armenian school where the presenter complained that the number of students, dropped, and their own students from their own cultural background did not show any interest in the culture or the language of the Armenian people, for example. Mm-hmm. And she was wondering, how she could bring them back to realize who they are and how, to inculcate that culture to their descendants, mm-hmm. and preserve it. What would you do? I mean, mm-hmm. in a classroom where you have diversity of students, yeah. and among them, for example, students who reject their own heritage,
Well, my question is, why wouldn't they? Think about, what they've been, what they've experienced. Why wouldn't they reject? I mean, I remember being with my younger daughter when she started school. My granddaughter did the same thing. When I went to school and they were very young, they each said to me, "Please don't speak Spanish to us. Don't speak Spanish to us in school." Yeah. Yes, right. Don't speak. Yes. Yeah. Oh, well, the teacher said, did you see, then fire that teacher. But look, when my younger daughter started preschool, one of the young women, a young teacher, I brought her in, and Marisa spoke only Spanish because we spoke only Spanish at home to her, knowing that she will learn English. That is no problem. So we brought her in, and the teacher said, "Oh, I see she doesn't have language." I said, "She has language. It's just not the English language." And within 3 months, she was fluent in English, So, But why wouldn't kids reject their language and culture? Because when they see it disrespected so much, why wouldn't they? So it is an uphill struggle, but I made it a commitment, a priority as a teacher to say to kids, oh, you speak another language? Wow, you're so lucky. To give students the opportunity to speak those languages. Let me tell you what one teacher did with my older daughter. When we moved from New York, which is very diverse and had so much Spanish there for us, that we didn't have to worry about her losing Spanish. We moved to Amherst, Massachusetts, a much smaller town, not much diversity at the time. It's quite diverse now, or much more anyway. And so Alicia went into first grade with this teacher. And do you know that the teacher, she never took a class with cultural responsiveness. This was 37 years ago. She never took a class in this. She just had this instinct, right? She got a tutor from the college, from the university, to come and read stories to Alicia in Spanish all the time. Alicia was fluent in English. She was a reader, she was a writer at 4, So it wasn't that she was, it wasn't this deficit thing. She wanted her to maintain her Spanish. She asked the librarian to get books in Spanish for her. This was a long time ago. This teacher is fabulous. He's a fabulous teacher. Like I said, never took a class in multicultural education until, many years later. And she just naturally had this instinct to be inclusive and to affirm. And so I think that's what a teacher's responsibility is. You will never learn everything you need to about every single culture and group and language. You never will. It's impossible. But what you can do is focus on those students in front of you and what you can do to, affirm who they are. And that's what a teacher's responsibility has to be.
I like that you talked about the community circle with Miss Carmen, I believe. Mm-hmm. And we are aspiring teachers, and what I fear is we step in on first day, and then the principal talks about CST testing when it's August, and we are under enormous amount of pressure to meet those standardized testings. And I really aspire to be teachers like Ms. Carmen, who can value, the value of the students themselves instead of what they're able to do on a piece of paper and bubble in sheets. Yeah. How would you recommend us basically hiding under those political radars, and how would that classroom look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Talk about hiding. I had a teacher who, when we were teaching a course on using multicultural children's literature, and we were teaching out in the district. This was a few years ago. And I remember one of the teachers said, Sonia, I love all this literature that you're bringing in, and it's really wonderful. But we have the literacy police at our door all the time. And they want to know what page we're on and, what we're reading and so on. And it's none of this real literature. It's Basil's and it's, And so I said, but I say, look, push the envelope a bit. Don't get fired, but push the envelope a bit. Try new things that it doesn't say not to do them, right? So at the end of the semester, she said, Sonia, I just want you to know that I'm using some of the children's literature. So what I do is that I put it in the Basil, I read it to the kids, and then when the literacy police come in, I just, I show her the page that I'm on in the Basil. So it's hiding under the radar, yes. So develop some of those strategies. But even more important, develop allies. Do not do this alone, because you won't last. You won't last. That was a lesson that I had to learn as a teacher, that you have to develop allies who will have your back like you will have their back, who will give you support, who will cheer you on, who will, help you become a better teacher, who will do things with you. You need that. Without that, you really won't survive.
And with those words, thank you so much, Sonia, for your words, for your inspiration, for your challenge. We have a little appreciation gift for you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, good. Beautiful. Thank you very much.
And we hope that when you're in the west side, you'll remember us and not just Loyola Marymount up the hill. So
I will.
Thanks so much for attending, everybody. But before you leave, there are some comment cards over in the credenza, and we'd really appreciate your feedback about the session this evening, our Distinguished Lecture Speaker Series, and we'd like your thoughts on future speakers. And I'd also like to point out that this event would not be possible without the generous support of Mr. Don and Dr. Susan Rice. Dr. Rice is an alumna of the Pepperdine and a member of the Pepperdine University Board of Regents and chair of the GSAP Board of Visitors. Be sure to obtain parking discount stamps downstairs on the first floor. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. And again, Sonia, thank you so much for your words. And it's